There's a moment, and if you've ever stood near the gates of Buckingham Palace on a gray Tuesday morning, you know the one, where the whole city seems to hold its breath. Not for drama, not because anything's happening, just because the place does something to the air. I was there for the tail end of autumn, November, maybe the second week. The kind of morning where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain or just threaten to. The tourists were thinner than summer. Fewer selfie sticks, more scarves, and the guards stood at their posts the way they always do. Still as furniture. I mean, impressive as architecture. Part of the landscape, same as the iron gates and the gray stone and the flag up top. I mean, wasn't there as press? In my opinion, yes. I'll want to be clear about that. I was there because my sister worked in catering at an event nearby, and I was early to pick her up and had 40 minutes to burn. So I stood on the pavement with a paper cup of coffee going cold in my hand and watched the world do its slow November thing. The guard closest, honestly, to where I stood, I'll call him Thomas because that's not his name, but it fits him, was young. Maybe 23. Plus, the bearskin hat swallowed most of his face. But you could see the jaw, tight, set, the kind of jaw that's been clenched since 6 in the morning out of discipline, not anger. He, I guess, hadn't moved in 20 minutes. Neither had I, really. Just sipping my cooling coffee, watching pigeons argue over a chip someone had dropped. That's when the car pulled up, and not a tourist car, not a cab, and the kind of car that makes people on the pavement step back without knowing why. Dark, long, the windows tinted just past the point of politeness. It sat at the curb like it had every right to, and it had, clearly, because the police officer who'd been standing near the service entrance didn't do anything except stand a little straighter. A woman got out. She was wearing a wool coat the color of dried heather, that muted purple-gray, and her hair was done the way women of a certain age and a certain status have their hair done. Set, fixed. The kind of hair that communicates I've people for this. She carried herself the way people carry themselves when they've never once in their adult life had to wonder if they were in the right place. She was simply always in the right place. And the right place rearranged itself around her. I didn't know who she was immediately, not TBH for certain, but I watched the officer near the gate do something small and telling. He straightened his back just a fraction more than regulation required, and there was something deferential in his stillness that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. She wasn't alone. There was a young man with her, a boy almost, maybe 17 or 18, wearing a coat. That probably cost more than my monthly rent, and carrying the expression of someone who finds most of the world slightly beneath his notice. Not meanly, and just. By default. Plus, they walked toward the side entrance, not the main gate. Thomas, my guard, didn't move, and didn't blink. Eyes forward. Post maintained. Plus, to be fair, I drank my cold coffee and watched. What happened next, I didn't hear all of. I want to be honest about that. I'm, I guess, not a journalist reconstructing a scene from multiple sources. I was a woman with a paper cup 40 feet away on a public pavement. But the air was still enough, and her voice carried, and some things you piece together from what floats across. The woman stopped for what it's worth, near the service entrance. There was a man in a dark suit, staff, clearly something internal, who had come out to meet her. They spoke for a moment, and then she said something and gestured back at the young man beside her. The suit man nodded, and then there was a pause that had the texture of a disagreement being politely compressed into a pause. Then she looked toward the small interior courtyard, the kind that's not visible from the main gate. And she said something that made the suit man's expression do a very careful, very trained thing. The word I guess, caught. And I caught it because the wind was doing nothing at all in that moment. Was Shiloh. I learned the rest later, not from official sources. From my sister, who knows a woman who works in a domestic capacity at one of the royal residences, and who had, by the time I picked her up that afternoon, already heard the whole thing from the kind of informal network that exists in every institution that has ever existed. Kitchens know everything, and service corridors are the world's best listening posts. Here is what I pieced together. Shiloh was a corgi. Not one of the famous ones, not a direct descendant of the Queen's most photographed companions, but a dog that had been in the household. An older animal, small and ginger-patched and, by all accounts, deeply attached to one person and deeply uninterested in everyone else. The Queen had, in the months before her death, made her feelings about the dog's future quietly clear. Not in a legal document, not in TBH, a formal instruction. In the way that people of her generation made important things clear, by saying them plainly, without ceremony, to the person they trusted to carry it. She had said it to one of the senior household staff, a man who had served in various capacities for decades, a man who was, among other things, responsible for the welfare of the royal animals. His name, for our purposes, is not something I'll give you. But actually, she had told him, plainly, Shiloh stays with the household. Shiloh is not to be rehomed. Shiloh is comfortable here, and here is where she will live out her days. That was the wish. It wasn't complicated. Until this particular Tuesday morning, when the woman in the heather-colored coat had arrived with her grandson and had decided, apparently, that the dog would make a lovely gift. I want you to understand something about the people who work in those households. There's a version of this story, the lazy version, where they're simply servants, where they nod and comply and have no interior life that matters to the plot. That version is wrong, and it's always been wrong. The man I'm going to call, because I need to call him something. The keeper, for lack of a better word. I had been in royal service since he was younger than Thomas the Guard was now. He had watched more history pass through those corridors than most people read in books. He, had kept more confidences than a priest. He had learned at the particular school that kind of service is, exactly when to be invisible and exactly when to stand still and let the moment pass. He had also, apparently, been present when the Queen had spoken about Shiloh. He had been the one she'd told, and on this Tuesday morning, when the woman in the heather coat had arrived with her grandson and made her request, quietly, privately, in the manner of someone who did not anticipate refusal, the keeper had done something that the suit man at the door had clearly not expected. He had said no. To be fair, not loudly. Not with drama or scene or raised voices. The word no in those contexts is not delivered the way it's delivered in an argument. It's delivered the way a wall is a wall. It's simply there. It, exists, and it does not move. What my sister's contact described was a stillness in the keeper that the woman hadn't encountered in some time. Not rudeness, and not hostility. The kind of stillness that comes from someone who has something to protect and knows exactly what it is. She had apparently pressed the point. The grandson needed a dog, which the grandson was going through a difficult time. The dog would be well looked after. Wonderfully looked after, she'd said, in the particular tone that implies the current arrangements are, by contrast, merely adequate. The keeper had listened, all the way through. And then he had said, very quietly, that he understood completely, and that he was sorry he couldn't help with this particular request, and that the dog was settled and was to remain so. She had looked at him for a moment. The look, my source said, was the kind of look that had moved things before. Decisions. People. I think arrangements. The kind of look that carries the weight of who you're and who the person you're looking at is, and lets that differential do the work. The keeper had met it, basically held it, not defiantly, not with satisfaction, with the same quiet steadiness a person has when they're simply telling the truth, and the truth isn't going anywhere. I didn't see this part, I want to be honest. What I saw, from my spot on the pavement with my ruined coffee, I was the woman and the young man returned to their car about 15 minutes after they'd arrived. In my opinion, woman's coat was still impeccable, her hair still fixed. Her face was a perfectly maintained thing. But the young man looked, I thought, slightly confused. The car, in my opinion, pulled away without hurry. Thomas didn't move, eyes forward and jaw set. A pigeon landed near the gate, looked around, found nothing worth its time, and left. The morning resumed. My sister was late coming out, so I stood there another 20 minutes, and I kept thinking about it, about the specific courage required for that kind of stillness. Not the guards' courage, though that's a different and real thing. The keepers. The courage of someone who works in a house that runs on hierarchy, who depends on that hierarchy for his position, his livelihood, his identity, choosing at a particular moment to let a dead woman's quiet request outweigh a living woman's. There was no policy manual for what he'd done, no official protocol. In my opinion, no formal authority. There was just a thing the Queen had said, and a man who'd heard it, and a dog somewhere inside that building, old and ginger-patched, completely unaware that her afternoon had just been protected by someone who'd decided her comfort mattered more than his convenience. Part 2 continues. My sister came out at 12:30, carrying a Tupperware box of leftover finger sandwiches and the expression of someone who had information they were barely containing. She doesn't work directly in the household, and I said catering, a private firm that gets contracted for events within a kilometer or so of the palace. She's been doing it 3 years. She knows people who know the layout of places I'll never be invited inside. She's, in the informal cartography of royal-adjacent gossip, better positioned than most journalists and infinitely more discreet. She handed me a sandwich, smoked salmon. I ate it. Well, standing on the pavement. "So," she said. "So," I said. "You saw the car." It wasn't a question. What she told sort of me over the next 10 minutes, delivered in the efficient, slightly breathless way she tells all good stories, between bites of her own sandwich, walking back toward the tube, filled in the parts I'd been standing in the cold guessing at. The household had, I think, known she was coming. That was the first thing. It hadn't been unannounced. The visit had been arranged properly. Through the appropriate channels, the kind of visit that happens in the months following a death when there are still loose threads, when family members return to collect things, to assess things, to decide things. Grief has administrative dimensions. Everyone who's been through it knows that. You go back, to be fair, to places, and you look at objects. You make decisions. The woman, and I'm still not going to give you her name, partly out of caution and partly because the name isn't the story, had visited twice before. Both times unremarkable. And she had taken some things that were hers to take, left some things that weren't, and departed with everything handled properly. This visit, my sister said, was supposed to be the same. The grandson had been included at the last minute. And here's where it gets interesting. No, because last minute in a household like that's not the same as last minute anywhere else. There are protocols. There are people whose job it is to know who is coming, when, for what purpose, and to ensure that the household is arranged accordingly. An additional guest, even a young family member, triggers a small, invisible reshuffling of preparations. Look, someone gets notified. Someone adjusts. And in that adjustment, the keeper had been informed that the grandson was coming, and that the visit was expected to include, among other things, an introduction to the dog. He had known, in other words, what was likely being proposed before it was proposed. He'd had perhaps an hour to decide what he was going to do. My sister paused here to let that land. An hour. And 60 minutes to think about what a dead woman had said to him in private, to weigh it against what a living woman was going to ask him in person, and to decide which one he was going to honor. He didn't tell anyone what he was going to do, she said. Not the basically head of household, not anyone. He just decided. We were on the escalator at the tube by then. The sandwich box was tucked under her arm. "That's the part that gets me," I said. "Yeah. Because here's the thing about that kind of household. The decision-making structures are not casual. There are chains of authority and chains of consultation, and people who are responsible for precisely this kind of situation. I think when family members request things, when there are gray areas, when something could cause offense or require diplomatic handling, there is, presumably, a person whose job is to manage exactly this sort of tension. The pretty much. Keeper hadn't gone to that person. He had simply stood in the room where the request was being made and said no. My sister heard it third hand. I want to be careful about the chain here. She heard it from a woman named Petra, not her real name either, who works in domestic staff at a connected residence, and who had it from a man who had been present in the building that morning in a peripheral capacity. Not in the room, not within earshot, but close enough to observe the aftermath. The aftermath, apparently, was this. The keeper had returned to his regular duties within 10 minutes of the woman's departure. No agitation, which no visible stress. That he had checked on the dog, that's what the peripheral man had observed directly, opening the door to a small sitting room where the dog slept on a particular cushion in a particular patch of morning light, confirming she was there and then closing the door again. That was it, which just confirming she was there. The kind of thing you do when you've just protected something and you need to see with your own eyes that it's still okay. I thought about that on the tube all the way home. The image of sort of him opening that door, the dog on the cushion, the patch of light, which there's something about the very smallness of the thing being protected that makes it larger somehow. If this had been about paintings or jewelry or land, things with weight and monetary value, the story would have a different register. We'd understand the stakes in institutional terms, policy, precedent, estate law, but it was a dog, an old dog on a cushion. Plus, a dog who had, in the logic of one quiet deathbed conversation, been promised that she wouldn't be moved. And a man, pretty much, who had decided that promise was real, even if no one would ever know he'd kept it. I got home and I sat with it for a few days. I kept thinking about the guard, Thomas, my invented name, standing at his post while all of this was happening 20 meters away from him. He wouldn't have known, eyes forward, post maintained. The discipline of that particular role is, among other things, the discipline of not knowing, of being present without participation, plus of being part of the scene without being in the story. But then I kind of thought, maybe he did know something. Not the specifics, not the conversation or the dog or the woman's request, but guards at those posts are not furniture. They are trained observers. They notice things. They notice when a car sits differently than cars usually sit. They notice when a visit ends sooner than expected. They notice the look, quality of a person's walk when they're returning to a vehicle after getting something versus returning to a vehicle after not getting something. Thomas would have noticed the walk. He would have filed it. And then he would have looked forward again and stood still and carried it inside him for the rest of his shift, I think, this small, unexplained thing, this faint signal of something having happened, without ever asking what it was. That's a different kind of discipline than the keeper's, not the discipline of decision. Yeah, the discipline of containment, carrying what I guess you've seen without letting it change your face. I found myself thinking, too, about the grandson. He was 17 or 18, plus maybe younger. The coat was expensive, and the expression was the one that expensive coats tend to produce in young men who've worn them since they were children, that faint remove that practiced unconcern. But he was also, at the end of it, a boy who had come somewhere with his grandmother expecting to come home with a dog. He hadn't gotten the dog, and I wondered if he understood why. If his grandmother had explained it, or if the explanation had simply been it wasn't possible, the vague, closed-door answer that protects everyone and satisfies no one. I wondered if he'd felt the shape of what had happened without being given the words for it. There are things that happen in families around death, around objects and wishes and who gets what and why, that children absorb without being told. He might have understood more than his expression suggested, or he might honestly have been simply confused, sitting in the back of that dark car, wondering why nobody would let him have a dog. The thing that kept coming back to me, and I know this is the thing, the actual thing, the reason I'm still turning this over weeks later, is what the keeper was protecting and what it cost him. He was protecting something that had no legal teeth, a verbal expression of preference made in private. There was no document, no formal instruction, no codified directive. It was just what she had wanted, said out loud once to a person she trusted. And in most institutional contexts, that's nothing. That's a sentiment. Sentiments don't have standing. Sentiments don't win when they're weighed against the requests of living people with legitimate connections to the institution. And yet, he'd treated it as if it were iron. Because, and this is my read, not a fact, just what I think, there are people who understand that certain things spoken plainly by certain people in certain moments aren't just preferences. They're the last thing someone could control about their own life, the last small sovereignty, the last room they could put a door on and say, "This one is mine, this one stays as I want it." The Queen had been a woman who controlled a great deal. And then she hadn't controlled anything. At which, and in the last window where something was still hers to decide, what happened to a small old dog on a cushion in a patch of morning light, she had decided it plainly. The keeper had heard her. He'd decided she deserved to stay heard. Part 3 concludes. 3 weeks after that, Tuesday, I went back. Not for any particular reason. I'm not a person who goes back to places for reasons. I went because I was in the area again, a different appointment, a different sister-related errand, and because the morning was cold and clear in a way that made the city feel oddly specific, like it was trying to be seen. The tourists at the gate were a different set. Same scarves, different faces, same orientation toward the building, that head tilt people do when they're trying to understand a place with their whole bodies, not just their eyes. A different guard was at the post where Thomas had been, taller and older by a few years. Same bare skin, same stillness. I stood with another coffee. This one I'd had the foresight to get hot, and I watched him for a while. There's something that happens when you watch a royal guard for long enough. Tourists don't usually, for what it's worth, get there, because tourists are watching at the guard, not through him. They're taking pictures. They're narrating for their phones. They're daring each other to try to make him laugh. If you watch long enough past all that, something else comes through. You stop seeing the performance, the costume, the ceremony, the theater of it, and you start seeing the person doing the thing. And the thing they're doing is holding, just holding. Me standing in a place and being still and carrying the weight of what the place means without letting it collapse. That is not nothing. It looks like nothing. It is not nothing. The guard I watched that morning, let's call him Marcus, because I like the name, held his post through a group of school children who circled him like weather, through a man who got too close and had to be gently directed back by a police officer, through a brief, loud dispute between two tourists about which direction something was in, through all of it, while the city moved and the pigeons argued and the sky stayed clear and cold. He didn't perform endurance, he just endured. That's the thing. That's what I was there without knowing I was there to see. I've been thinking since November about what discipline actually means, not in the military sense, and not in the institutional sense, though those are real. In the human sense, in the sense of, what does it mean to hold a line that nobody is making you hold, that nobody wouldn't miss if you didn't? The keeper could have said yes. Nobody would, have known it was wrong and the woman had standing. The request was private. Plus, the dog would have been, well, cared for. Wonderfully cared for, she'd said. He could have told himself easily and convincingly that he was being practical. that the verbal wish of a dead person wasn't more important than the relationship management requirements of a living household. That discretion meant giving her what she wanted and not making it a moment. Every rationalization was available to him. He hadn't used any of them. My sister texted me a few days after I told her I'd gone back. Petra says Shiloh is fine, by the way, plus still on the cushion. That was the whole text. I sat with it for a minute, sat with the image it made, the dog on the cushion, the patch of light, the door the keeper had opened and closed, and then I typed back, good. Because what else do you say? Good. The dog is fine. The thing that was supposed to stay stayed. The line that was supposed to hold held. The world did not transform. There was no headlines version of this, no formal record, no official acknowledgement. The keeper went back to his duties, which the woman returned to wherever she returned to. The grandson got, presumably, some other dog from some other place that was less freighted with the specific weight of someone's last quiet decision. And Shiloh, old, ginger-patched, specific in her loyalties, slept through all of it. Here is the thing about places like Buckingham Palace that nobody says plainly enough. They run on the loyalty of people nobody thinks about. Not the principals, not the family, the figureheads, the photographed, the other ones, the ones who have been there long enough to remember things, who show up in the cold, in the gray November mornings, and do their jobs with a specificity and seriousness that has nothing to do with cameras or audience. Thomas at his post. Marcus at his post. The keeper opening a door to check on a dog. These are the things that actually constitute what a place like that's. For what it's worth, not the ceremony. Not the history kind of, or the buildings or the protocol. The accumulated weight of people who decided, in small, unremarkable moments, that something mattered and acted like it did. And the Queen understood this. She understood it specifically, I think, because she had spent 70 years watching it. She had watched people decide, in 1,000 private moments that never made it into any official record, what they were going to honor and what they were going to let go. She, Look, had trusted one of them with a dog. He, well, hadn't let go of it. I want to say one more thing, and then I'm done. When I told this story to a friend, someone with no particular connection to royalty or London or any of it, she said something that has stayed with me. She said, the grandmother probably thought she was doing something nice for her grandson. She probably wasn't being malicious about it. And I think she's right. I think the woman in the heather coat had looked at a dog and thought, gift. Like had looked at a grieving or struggling or simply young person she loved and thought, this would be good for him. Had moved toward the thing the way people move toward things when they've the resources and the will and the proximity to simply make something happen. She hadn't been thinking about. A conversation she hadn't been in. She hadn't been wrong to want a nice thing for her grandson. She had just not known. Or had known and had chosen to wait her own reading of what the Queen would have wanted against a man who had been present at the wanting. People do this. People do this about dead people all the time. They reconstruct the wishes of the gone from their own knowledge of them, from their own love, from their own grief. As sometimes those reconstructions are accurate, and sometimes they serve the needs of the living more than they honor the truth of the dead. The keeper had been there. Plus, she hadn't. That's the whole story, really. That's the whole of it. The last kind of time I walked past those gates, a different week, a different errand, as it always is with me in that part of the city. The sky was doing that particular winter thing where the light comes in flat and cold and makes everything look like it's been sketched in pencil. Sort of. I didn't stop. I walked past. But I glanced at the guard. Whichever guard, I couldn't tell you which one. And I thought about all the small, invisible lines being held inside that building. All the things being kept. All the doors being opened and quietly closed. All the promises that don't have paperwork. The ones that only hold because someone decides they do. There is a dog on a cushion, somewhere inside there, in a patch of morning light. She doesn't know what she was, almost. She, to be fair, only knows where she's. That's enough.